Hi, and welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and this the second of two films on Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled life. The first one set out what his ideas were, and this one is going to give a critique, and it's going to be based on the arguments and the points that were made during the discussion that we've now had on the book. And I've set these out in two parts with the self-evident headings of firstly celebration and secondly missed opportunity. In terms of celebration, there were lots of things that we really liked about the book. We all thought that Sheldrake is a really good writer and it's a brilliant topic. There was also a strong sense that the book was an embodied book, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And also, a number of us liked the way that the book seemed to reflect a larger paradigm shift that's occurring at the moment in lots of new arguments and writing about the nature of our society and our wider existence. But there was also a really interesting exploration of the book's limitations, not so much in opposition or instead of the things that we liked, but more in the sense that the book didn't, for some, and I've got to say this was very much a minority view, but a really interesting one nonetheless. And the sense then that the book didn't reach its full potentials for two reasons really. Firstly, by devoting so much time to kind of stacking up its scientific credibility, and secondly, more fundamentally and in terms of our discussion, more controversially, by presenting and thereby distorting the nature of fungal life through human language and human values. So those are going to be the themes I'll develop over the next few minutes. So what did we celebrate then, beginning with celebration? Well, as I've said, pretty much all of us thought Sheldrake to be a very good writer. He's technically accomplished, his text is warm, engaging and intimate, and he uses great metaphors. At one point he says, "A school of thought scattered through my mind like startled minnows." And as I've said, the topic was brilliant and full of great material of the wonders of science, or as one of our book club put it, the incredible stories of science. And of course, this particular incredible story was all about how the power and the potential of fungi is way beyond what most of us could have imagined. And it's also a story about its tenacity and endurance and life-giving gifts and capacity to transform. A story perfectly encapsulated, we thought, in the book's subtitle, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds and Shape Our Futures. We also felt it to be an embodied book. That is to say that the book embodies lots of things really. It embodies his argument, it embodies him as a person, and it also embodies a sensibility playful but at the same time reverent and intuitively democratic, which in its feel and its flavour produces a writing very, very different to the sometimes colder versions of traditional science, presenting a form of knowledge that seems to echo the open and organic nature of his material, all of which is brilliantly symbolised at the end when he gives over his book back to fungi. Now that this book is made, he says, I can hand it over to the fungi to unmake. And with a little bit of help, he turns one of his copies into oyster mushrooms and another into beer, which I'll drink, he says, to close the circuit. All of which shows just how well he is able to combine the book's form and its function. And as well as an embodied book, it's also a rooted book, rooted in his childhood and the personality of his parents. His mother, Jill Peirce, a shaman and a therapist, steeped in a wide range of knowledge and practice about interconnectedness. And his father, Rupert Sheldrake, a hugely influential figure in paranormal psychology, with his idea of the synergetic field as fields of energy and communication. And as the book shows, Both his parents were close to those like Terence McKenna, who was experimenting with psychedelics in the 1960s as a way to access the unconscious and the transpersonal, and generating incredible therapeutic outcomes in the treatment of addiction and mental disorder. And all these voices breathe through the book, as does his own personality as a likeable, warm, open, unshowingly clever, fun to be with, alive to the awe of nature kind of guy, whose life experiences are the soil from which the book has grown. And this very much includes his own psychedelic experience when he was invited, along with a range of academics and scientists, to take part in a scientific experiment by bringing an unanswered problem to a carefully constructed psychedelic experience, which he describes in the book as instrumental in taking him into the mystery of fungi, brilliantly describing the bewildering impossibility of actually trying to quantify this experience, which is essentially a mystical experience. And if there's a quality that these intellectual, emotional and personal embodiments, it's the quality of openness. So like the fungal networks and their expansive mycorrhizal mycelium, the book is open. Like his father's sense of synergetic field, it's always looking for connections. And in that sense, it doesn't follow the usual academic format of declaring a thesis and stacking up the evidence to support it. Instead, and to apply one of his own descriptions, which he gives to the nature of fungi, instead, his writing is a kind of speculation in bodily form, tentative and without definitive answer, and often communicated as much through feeling as it is through thought. All of which I felt to be very well conveyed by one of our book club when he said, all in all, it blurred lots of boundaries and it certainly conveyed lots of information to me. But it didn't just convey information. I think it conveyed a feeling, his feeling and now my feeling about fungi. So all of these aspects of the book's writing, form and content was celebrated, as was the sense that the book is a really good example of a wider paradigm shift that is currently taking place in our thinking and has been very much manifest in the many books that this book club has been looking at. And a good way to understand this is to reference Ian McGilchrist's seminal book, The Master and His Emissary, and I refer to this an awful lot. And in that book, he tells us that the attention that we bring to the world changes what we find there. And in the left and right hemispheres of our brain, we create different and distinct worlds. The left hemisphere, which has dominated our culture for the last 300 years and perhaps finds its purest form in science, stands back from the living world, divides it into disembodied and abstract segments, which it then reconstructs symbolically through language. And by doing this, McGilchrist argues that it gives us great focus, control, and the power to manipulate. But ultimately, it is disembodied and lifeless, a kind of virtual world, if you like. Whereas the right hemisphere produces an account of the world which is embodied and incarnate and fully embedded in the world that it seeks to represent. Now, this is a very short explanation of a very long book, but for obvious reasons, Sheldrake's book looks like a very good representative of this way of thinking. And it's part of a larger dissident literature addressing what might be called the pathologies of modernity, including a kind of hubristic and overreaching rationalism, a rationalism built on the illusion of self-reliant individuality, which reduces everything to separate parts in order to assert control over nature, and which for many of us is an approach which is destroying the planet. And in books like Entangled Life, The Secret Lives of Trees, braiding sweetgrass and humankind, we have a literature reclaiming the ideas of interdependence and cooperation, and very much asserting a different model of humanity and the natural world of which it is a part. And in all of this, this book fits into these forms of new writing, blurring the scientific, the personal and the imaginative from an author who, like fungi, defies binary style. He's a bit of an explorer, he's a bit of an adventurer, he's a bit of an ethnographer who brews his own beer, kneels down into the earth and gets his hands dirty. So these were the things that were celebrated in our discussion. But if we now turn to the theme of missed opportunity, which is really the way that I've tried to describe what I thought was a really interesting minority view that emerged during the discussion. And it did so both as a critique, but at the same time as a compliment to the book, suggesting that the book was indeed very good, but some of its potential was in some ways limited by spending too much time stacking up its scientific credibility and speaking too much through human language and human values. So looking at the first of these, those of this persuasion felt that he spent quite some time seeking to establish his scientific authority, making some of its middle sections for them heavy going, at times repetitive, and for some too long. And for these kinds of readers, the book very much came alive in the latter sections when he seems to have got, if you like, all the science and point proving out of the way, returning to the personal. And here some of us would have liked much more on things like his LSD experience to give a much greater sense of what that was like. The second argument that emerged concerning Sheldrake's perceived reliance on language and values was for some quite a surprising claim to hear, because in the book Sheldrake makes it very clear that the world of fungi cannot be captured through human categories, and certainly not by what he calls our well-worn metaphors. But according to this minority view, he says this, but he doesn't do it. He doesn't follow his own rule, using our human language, very much drenched in human meanings and human expectations, to describe what he says it cannot describe, which is to say he uses words and metaphors to render the unknowable strangeness of fungal life not just comprehensible, but comfortably familiar, and in so doing is somehow stripping it of the very strangeness which is its essential character or nature. And given that he's such a good writer and is exploring so many interesting things, this view saw this as something of a missed opportunity, whereby instead of going down the scientific route, he might have sought to capture the inexplicable essence of fungi through the artistic imagination and writers of imaginative power, writers such as Proust and Kafka and Joyce and Beckett, many of whom have sought to stretch to its limit, stretch language to its limit, precisely to express things beyond language. And this, of course, led to a very lively, if inconclusive, debate. But for many in our group, asking this of Sheldrake, asking him to speak in a language that isn't human, is either asking too much or missing just how much Sheldrake, despite the limitations of language, which he's clearly alive to, has done to help us glimpse the magic and the magnificence and the mystery of fungal life. It's true when he tells us all models seeking to explain fungal life are infused with human values. But for many of us, if this points to a contradiction in his writing, it's one that can be consciously and creatively held. And perhaps, given we are all locked into our language, perhaps the best we can hope for is to edge closer to a better sense of reality through a tapestry of multiple perspectives. Or perhaps more radically, the possibility of psilocybin, with its gift of expansive consciousness, points to a more democratic and hopeful window through which we might glimpse into the mysteries of fungal life. And so to conclude, overall our book club thought this to be an excellent book. Yes, it might have had greater ambition to communicate the otherness of fungal life through the artistic imagination, but perhaps this would be for another book. And yes, he speaks in the idiom of science, but perhaps that shouldn't surprise us too much, given that Sheldrake is a scientist. He's a scientist himself who knows his stuff and sees how what he cares about can be illuminated by science, or at least a certain kind of science. A science like himself, self-reflective, self-critical, and respectful of the natural world. And Sheldrake is such a scientist, telling one of its incredible stories. A story that seems to come up from the roots, engaging, warm and hopeful, and well worth the read.